The wind was already screaming when Jack Callahan stepped out of the saloon. It wasn't the kind of wind that cooled a man's skin. It was the kind that carried grit sharp enough to cut. The late afternoon sun bled across the horizon, staining the sky in shades of copper and rust. Every shadow in Dry Creek seemed longer, darker, as if the town itself was holding its breath. Jack's boots hit the warped wooden planks of the porch with a steady rhythm, deliberate, unhurried. His right hand hovered near the worn grip of his Colt, not because he was nervous, but because he knew what was coming. He could feel it in the air, the way a man feels the first drop of rain before a storm breaks. From the far end of Main Street, the sound of hooves thundered closer. Dust rose in a choking cloud, swallowing the road in a haze. Through it, shapes emerged, riders, at least 8 of them. Their silhouettes jagged against the dying light. They moved like a single creature, a pack with one purpose, him. Jack's jaw tightened. He'd been expecting them since the moment he'd stepped back into Dry Creek after 3 years away. The McGraw gang didn't forgive, and they sure as hell didn't forget. He'd taken something from them once, not gold, not land, but pride. And pride was the kind of wound that never healed. The first rider broke through the dust, a tall man with a scar running from his temple to his jaw, eyes like cold steel. Mason McGraw, leader of the gang, the man who'd sworn, in front of half the territory, that he'd put Jack Callahan in the ground. Callahan, Mason's voice cut through the wind like a whip crack. You've got one chance to walk away. Leave this town, and maybe I'll let you keep breathing. Jack didn't move. His gaze swept over the gang, the twitchy one with the shotgun, the hulking brute with a chain wrapped around his fist, the weary kid whose eyes darted like a cornered animal. He memorized their faces, their weapons, their stances. Every detail mattered. In a fight like this, hesitation was death. I'm not here to walk away, Jack said, his voice low but carrying. I'm here to finish what we started. The street went silent except for the restless shifting of horses. Somewhere, a door creaked shut. A curtain twitched. The townsfolk knew better than to get caught in the middle of this. Mason's smile was slow, cruel. Then I guess we'll give the folks a show. The gang began to spread out, fanning across the street, cutting off every escape. Jack's heartbeat was steady, but his mind was a storm, calculating distances, angles. The weight of the revolver at his side. He could feel the heat of the sun on his neck, the grit between his teeth, the faint tremor in the boards beneath his boots as the horses shifted. And then, without warning, Mason's hand twitched toward his holster. Jack moved. The first shot cracked like lightning, shattering the stillness. Mason's hat flew from his head as Jack's bullet grazed past, close enough to make him flinch. Before the echo faded, Jack was already stepping sideways, drawing the gang's fire away from the saloon doors. Bullets tore splinters from the porch rail, punched holes in the dust-thick air. Jack dropped low, rolled behind a water trough, and fired twice, one shot catching the weary kid in the shoulder, spinning him from his saddle. The second slammed into the shotgunner's leg, sending him crashing to the dirt with a howl. The air was chaos now, gunfire, shouting, the panicked screams of horses. Jack's breath came in sharp bursts, but his hands were steady. He could feel the fight narrowing, every second stretching long and thin. He wasn't just shooting, he was reading them, predicting them, staying one step ahead. Mason roared something Jack couldn't hear over the din, and the brute with the chain charged. Jack waited until the last possible moment, then sidestepped, letting the man's momentum carry him past. The chain whistled through the air, missing Jack's head by inches. Jack's revolver barked once, and the brute crumpled into the dust. 3 down. The rest hesitated now, their confidence cracking. Jack could see it in their eyes, the flicker of doubt, the realization that this wasn't going to be the easy kill they'd imagined. He pressed the advantage, moving fast, firing with precision. Another rider fell, clutching his side. Another's gun spun from his hand as Jack's bullet struck the barrel. And then it was just Mason. The leader sat his horse, breathing hard, eyes locked on Jack. The wind tugged at his coat, carrying the smell of gunpowder and blood. For a moment, neither man moved. The world seemed to shrink until it was just the two of them. The space between them heavy with everything unsaid. You should have stayed gone, Mason said. Jack's voice was calm, almost quiet. You should have been better at catching me. Mason's hand twitched again, but Jack was faster. The shot was clean, final. Mason toppled from his saddle, hitting the dirt with a dull thud. The wind carried the last of the dust away, revealing the street littered with the fallen. The silence settling like a shroud. Jack holstered his revolver and stood there for a long moment, letting the weight of it all sink in. His chest rose and fell, his muscles still taut with the memory of the fight. But his eyes were steady. He'd won, again. Somewhere, a door creaked open. A cautious face peered out. Life in Dry Creek would go on. For now. Jack turned, the setting sun casting his shadow long across the street, and walked away without looking back. The bodies lay still in the settling dust, their shadows stretching long under the fading sun. When Jack Callahan stepped beyond the last building of Dry Creek, the wind had shifted, carrying with it a faint, almost mocking scent of rain from far-off hills. But it did nothing to wash away the metallic tang of blood that clung to the air. Behind him, the town was silent, not the peaceful kind of silence, but the brittle, fragile quiet that comes after violence, when everyone is afraid to speak too soon. He didn't look back. He never did. The trail ahead was a pale scar across the land, winding between brittle sagebrush and jagged rock. Jack's boots crunched over gravel, each step deliberate, the echo of gunfire still ringing faintly in his ears. The adrenaline from the fight still pulsed in his veins, but beneath it was something colder, heavier, the familiar weight of survival. He had won, but victory in the West was never clean. It left marks you couldn't see, debts you couldn't pay, and ghosts that followed you no matter how far you rode. Mason McGraw's eyes haunted him already. In those final seconds before the shot, they hadn't been filled with fear, nor even hate, but with something far more unsettling, recognition. As if Mason had known, deep down, that this was the only way it could end. Jack had been 17 the first time he killed a man. It hadn't been in a duel or a robbery gone wrong. It had been in a back alley in Carson Ridge, under a sky so black it swallowed the stars. The man had been twice his size, drunk and mean, and Jack had been cornered. The knife had found its way into his hand without him thinking. The rest was a blur of motion and heat, and the sound of someone gasping their last breath. He had told himself it was self-defense. Maybe it was. But the truth was, once you crossed that line, you never came back. And Jack had crossed it a long time ago. The sun was sinking low by the time he reached the old windmill on the outskirts. Its blades turned lazily in the breeze, creaking like an old man's bones. Jack stopped there, leaning against the weathered wood, letting the sound fill the silence. He knew Dry Creek wouldn't forget what happened today. Some would call him a hero. Others would call him a killer. Both would be right. The McGraw gang had been a plague on the territory for years, robbing stagecoaches, burning ranches, leaving bodies in their wake. Jack had tangled with them before, back when he'd been riding with a different crew, back when he still thought there was such a thing as a clean fight. That had been the first time he'd put Mason on the ground, humiliated him in front of his men. Mason had sworn revenge, and Jack had known it was only a matter of time before he came to collect. The windmill's shadow stretched long across the dirt as Jack lit a cigarette, the flare of the match briefly painting his face in gold. He drew in the smoke, letting it burn slow in his lungs. His hands were steady now, but his mind was restless, replaying every movement of the fight. The way the weary kid's eyes had gone wide when the bullet hit. The way the brute with the chain had stumbled forward before crumpling into the dust. He didn't take pleasure in it, but he didn't regret it either. Regret was a luxury men like him couldn't afford. Somewhere behind him, a door creaked open. He didn't turn, but he could feel eyes on him. The townsfolk would be peeking out now, measuring the man who had just saved them from the gang that had bled them dry for years. They'd whisper his name, tell stories about the way he stood his ground, the way he moved faster than the wind, but they wouldn't invite him in for supper. Men like Jack didn't get warm welcomes. They got nods from a distance, maybe a drink slid down the bar without a word, and that was fine. He wasn't here for thanks. The cigarette burned low, and he flicked it into the dirt, grinding it out beneath his boot. The sky was deepening into shades of violet and indigo, the first stars beginning to pierce through. He knew he couldn't linger. Mason's death would send ripples through the territory. The McGraw gang might be broken, but there were always others, cousins, friends, men who'd ridden with Mason once and would ride again for revenge. Out here, killing a man didn't end a feud. It just passed it on to the next in line. Jack adjusted the brim of his hat and started walking again, his long shadow stretching ahead of him. The land opened wide, endless and empty. The kind of space that could make a man feel both free and hunted at the same time. He thought about heading south, maybe crossing the border for a while, letting the heat die down. But part of him knew he wouldn't. Trouble had a way of finding him, no matter where he went. And maybe, deep down, he didn't mind. The night air was cooler now, the wind carrying the distant howl of a coyote. Jack's hand brushed the grip of his Colt, a habit more than a need. The weight of it was familiar, almost comforting. He'd lived by the gun for so long that he couldn't imagine life without it. It wasn't just a weapon, it was a promise that he'd never be caught unprepared, never be the one lying in the dust while someone else walked away. As he crested a low ridge, he paused, looking back one last time. Dry Creek was just a cluster of dark shapes against the fading light, the saloon's lanterns flickering like fireflies. Somewhere in that town, people were breathing easier tonight. Somewhere, a child was sleeping without fear for the first time in months. That was enough. He didn't need their thanks. He didn't need their friendship. He just needed to keep moving. Jack turned away from the town and started down the other side of the ridge, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust that swirled briefly before vanishing into the night. The stars were brighter now, scattered across the sky like silver dust. He walked on, the sound of his footsteps swallowed by the vast, open silence of the land. Ahead lay more miles, more towns, more men who'd want to test him. And when they came, he'd be ready. The night had settled over the plains like a heavy blanket, the stars sharp and cold against the black. Jack moved with the steady rhythm of a man who had walked more miles than he could count, his boots whispering over the dirt. Somewhere far behind him, Dry Creek was already folding the day's violence into its history, the way frontier towns always did, quickly, quietly, without ceremony. But Jack knew the story wouldn't end there. He felt it before he heard it, that subtle shift in the air, the way the wind seemed to carry a different weight. Then came the sound, faint at first, then clearer. Hoof beats, more than one horse. They were far off, but closing. Jack didn't break stride. He'd learned long ago that running only made the chase sweeter for the men behind you. Instead, he let his hand rest lightly on the Colt at his side, his eyes scanning the darkness ahead for cover. The land here was open, broken only by the occasional boulder or twisted mesquite. A half-mile ahead, he spotted the jagged outline of an old cattle corral, its fence half collapsed, the gate hanging by a single hinge. He angled toward it, his pace unchanging, the hoof beats behind him growing louder, steadier. Whoever they weren't in a hurry to catch him. That meant they were confident. He reached the corral and slipped inside, crouching low behind a section of fence still sturdy enough to hide him. The night was quiet except for the wind and the approaching riders. Jack's breathing slowed, his heartbeat settling into the calm, deliberate rhythm it always found before a fight. He could see them now, 3 riders, their shapes black against the starlit horizon. They rode in a loose formation, not worried about being seen. That told him they weren't bounty hunters. This was personal. The lead rider reined in just outside the corral, his horse snorting in the cool air. Callahan, the man called, his voice carrying easily in the stillness. "You've got something that belongs to us." Jack stayed silent. Words were just noise until you knew who you were talking to. The man shifted in his saddle, leaning forward. "Mason was my brother." That explained the confidence. This wasn't about money. This was blood. Jack rose slowly from behind the fence, the moonlight catching the edge of his hat brim. "Then you know how this ends," he said, his voice low, steady. The man's jaw tightened. "It ends with you in the ground." The next moments unfolded in a blur of motion and sound. The second rider spurred his horse forward, drawing a rifle from the scabbard. Jack's Colt was already in his hand, the first shot cracking through the night and sending the rider tumbling from the saddle. The third man swung wide, trying to flank him. But Jack pivoted, firing again, the bullet catching the rider in the leg and spinning him sideways. The leader dismounted in one fluid motion, drawing a long-barreled revolver. He was fast, faster than Jack expected, and the first shot tore a splinter from the fence, inches from Jack's head. Jack dropped low, rolling to the side, the dry dirt biting into his palms. He came up on one knee, sighted, and fired. The leader staggered, but stayed on his feet, his teeth bared in a snarl. They circled each other now, the corral fence casting long, broken shadows across the ground. Jack could hear the man's breathing, ragged but determined. This wasn't just revenge, it was desperation, the kind that made a man dangerous. The leader lunged first, firing twice in quick succession. One shot grazed Jack's arm, a hot line of pain slicing through muscle. Jack ignored it, stepping in close, too close for the man to bring his revolver to bear. He slammed his shoulder into the man's chest, knocking him backward into the fence. The wood groaned under the impact. The man swung wildly, the revolver clattering to the dirt. Jack caught his wrist, twisted hard, and drove his fist into the man's jaw. The fight went out of him in an instant, his body sagging against the fence. Jack stepped back, breathing hard, the Colt still steady in his hand. "You can ride out of here," Jack said, his voice flat. "Or you can stay and join your brother." The man's eyes burned with hate, but he said nothing. He stumbled to his horse, mounted awkwardly, and rode off into the darkness, the wounded rider limping after him. The third lay still in the dirt, groaning softly. Jack holstered his Colt and stepped out of the corral, the wind cool against the sweat on his skin. The stars above seemed sharper now, the night quieter, but he knew it wouldn't last. Mason's death had started something, and tonight had only fanned the flames. He started walking again, the horizon stretching endlessly ahead. Somewhere out there, more riders would come, and when they did, he'd be ready. The wind carried the scent of smoke long before Jack saw the glow. It was faint at first, just a whisper on the air, but it set his instincts on edge. He crested a low rise and stopped dead. Down in the shallow valley ahead, a campfire burned bright, its light flickering over the shapes of men and horses. There were too many for comfort, at least a dozen, maybe more, and they weren't just passing through. The way the horses were tethered, the way the men moved in and out of the firelight with purpose, told him this was no casual camp. They were waiting. Jack crouched low, letting the ridge hide him, and studied the scene. He could make out rifles leaning against saddles, the glint of steel in the firelight. A few men laughed, but it was the kind of laughter that didn't reach the eyes, sharp, brittle, masking tension. He knew that sound. These were men gearing themselves up for something ugly. He eased back from the ridge, his boots silent on the dry earth, and circled wide. If they were here for him, and he had no doubt they were, walking straight into their camp would be suicide. But avoiding them entirely wasn't an option either. They were too close to the trail, and sooner or later they'd spot him. The moon was high now, silvering the land, and every shadow seemed sharper. Jack moved like a ghost through the mesquite, keeping the wind in his face. He could hear snatches of conversation now, Mason's name, spoken low but with venom. So it was true. The McGraw bloodline wasn't done with him yet. He found a vantage point on a rocky outcrop overlooking the camp. From here, he could see the whole layout, the fire in the center, the men spread in a loose ring around it, the horses off to one side. They were disciplined enough to keep watch, but not disciplined enough to expect someone to come at them from above. That was their mistake. Jack checked his revolver, feeling the familiar weight in his hand. 12 men. He'd faced worse odds, but not without cost. He took a slow breath, steadying himself. This wasn't about glory. It was about ending this before it spread further, before more towns got caught in the crossfire. He moved down the slope, silent as the night, until he was close enough to hear the crackle of the fire and the low murmur of voices. One man stood apart from the rest, his back to Jack, a rifle slung over his shoulder. Jack closed the distance in 3 quick steps, his arm snaking around the man's neck, the other hand clamping over his mouth. A brief struggle, a muffled grunt, and the man sagged to the ground. The camp didn't notice. Not yet. Jack slipped into the shadows between 2 wagons, his eyes scanning for the leader. He spotted him near the fire, a broad-shouldered man with a scar across his cheek, speaking to the others with the easy authority of someone used to being obeyed. Jack knew that killing him first would throw the rest into chaos. He stepped out from the shadows, Colt raised, and the first shot shattered the night. The leader jerked back, the firelight catching the shock in his eyes before he crumpled. For a heartbeat, the camp froze. Then the shouting started. Men scrambled for weapons, some firing wildly into the darkness, others diving for cover. Jack moved fast, using the wagons and the fire's glare to his advantage. He fired, ducked, shifted position, fired again. Each shot was deliberate, each movement calculated to keep them guessing. A bullet tore past his ear, close enough to feel the heat. Another slammed into the wagon beside him, splintering the wood. He rolled, came up on one knee, and dropped a man who'd been trying to flank him. The air was thick with smoke and dust, the fire throwing wild shadows that made friend and foe alike seem to shift and blur. One by one, the gang began to falter. Without their leader, their coordination crumbled. Some broke for the horses, only to be cut down before they reached them. Others tried to rush Jack, but he met them with cold precision, each shot finding its mark. When the last man fell, the only sounds were the crackle of the fire and Jack's own breathing. He stood there for a moment, the Colt still in his hand, the night around him suddenly to quiet. Then he holstered the gun and turned away from the fire, leaving the camp to burn itself out. The trail ahead was dark again, the stars bright and cold above. Jack walked on, the smell of smoke fading behind him, knowing this wasn't the end. Men like the McGraws didn't forgive, and they didn't forget, but neither did he. The night after the campfire fight was colder than it had any right to be. Jack had put miles between himself and the burning wreck of the McGraw outpost, but the air still carried the faintest trace of smoke, as if the land itself was holding on to the memory. The moon hung low, pale and watchful, and every sound seemed sharper. The crunch of his boots on gravel, the whisper of wind through dry grass, the distant, lonely cry of a coyote. He didn't stop until he reached a narrow canyon, its walls rising like jagged teeth on either side. The place offered cover, but it also meant there was only one way in and one way out. He weighed the risk, then stepped inside, letting the shadows swallow him. The ground here was littered with old bones, cattle, maybe, or something less innocent, and the air was still, almost too still. Jack found a flat rock and sat, his back to the canyon wall, his Colt resting across his thigh. He'd learned to take rest where he could, even if it was only for a few minutes. But his mind wouldn't quiet. He kept replaying the last few days, Mason in the dust, the brother in the corral, the dozen men at the fire. Each fight had been a victory, but each victory had drawn more blood into the water. The McGraw name was a curse that wouldn't die easy. A faint scrape of stone pulled him from his thoughts. He froze, every muscle tightening. The sound came again, from above this time, the soft, deliberate shift of weight on rock. He slid into the deeper shadow of the wall, eyes scanning the rim of the canyon. A figure appeared against the moonlight, then another, and another. They were here. The first shot rang out, sparking off the rock inches from his head. Jack rolled, came up in a crouch, and fired back, the muzzle flash lighting the canyon walls in brief, violent bursts. The echoes were deafening, bouncing between the stone like trapped thunder. More shapes dropped down from the rim, boots hitting the ground with heavy thuds. Jack counted at least 6, maybe more in the shadows. They moved with purpose, fanning out to box him in. He shifted position constantly, never letting them pin him down, his shots precise and economical. One man fell clutching his chest, another spun away with a cry, his rifle clattering to the ground. But they kept coming. A tall man with a bandana over his face rushed him from the side, a knife glinting in his hand. Jack sidestepped, caught the man's wrist, and drove his shoulder into his gut, sending him sprawling into the dirt. Another came in swinging a length of chain, the metal whizzing through the air. Jack ducked low, felt the wind of it pass over his head, and fired point blank into the man's side. The canyon was chaos now, gunfire, shouts, the acrid bite of powder in the air. Jack's arm burned where a bullet had grazed him, but he pushed the pain aside. He moved like a man who'd been here before, who knew that hesitation was death. When the last shot faded, the only sound was the ragged rasp of his own breathing. The canyon floor was littered with bodies, the dust settling slowly in the moonlight. Jack stood still for a long moment, letting the silence return, feeling the weight of what had just happened press down on him. He holstered his Colt and stepped over the fallen, heading for the canyon's far end. The fight had been theirs to start, but it was his to finish, and he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that this wasn't the last time he'd have to prove it. The dawn came slow and blood-red, spilling over the ridges like a warning. Jack had walked through the night, the canyon fight still fresh in his muscles, the ache in his arm a constant reminder of how close it had been. The land ahead was open and harsh, the kind of country where a man could see trouble coming from miles away, and trouble could see him just as easily. By mid-morning, he spotted the dust cloud. It was faint at first, a smudge against the horizon, but it grew with every minute. Riders, many of them. He stopped on a rise, squinting into the glare. The shapes resolved into a line of horsemen, moving fast, the sun flashing off rifle barrels. At their head rode a man Jack recognized instantly, even from this distance, Caleb McGraw, Mason's cousin. Older, meaner, and far more cunning, Caleb wasn't like the others. He didn't waste men on reckless charges or drunken bravado. He planned, he waited, and when he struck, it was with precision. Jack had crossed paths with him once, years ago, in a border town where the law was just a rumor. That meeting had ended with Caleb swearing that if he ever saw Jack again, he'd put him in the ground. Now here he was, riding with at least 15 men, and the open plain offered no cover worth the name. Jack's eyes swept the land, searching for anything he could use. A half-mile to the west, a dry riverbed cut across the plain, its banks low but steep enough to break the line of sight. He started toward it at a steady pace, not running, but not wasting time either. The hoofbeats grew louder, the ground trembling under their weight. Jack slid down into the riverbed just as the first shots cracked through the air. Dirt kicked up around him, the sharp whine of bullets passing close. He dropped to one knee, drew his Colt, and fired back, the report echoing off the banks. One rider pitched sideways, tumbling into the dust, but the rest kept coming. They split into two groups, flanking him from both sides. Jack moved fast, keeping low, using the bends in the riverbed to mask his position. He fired, shifted, fired again, each shot deliberate. A man screamed and went down clutching his leg. Another's rifle flew from his hands as Jack's bullet struck the barrel. But Caleb was nowhere in sight. That was the part that worried him. The answer came a moment later, a shadow falling across him from above. Jack looked up just in time to see Caleb on the rim, rifle in hand, the barrel already dropping toward him. Jack dove sideways as the shot rang out, the bullet slamming into the dirt where he'd been. He rolled, came up firing, but Caleb had already moved. Vanishing from the edge, the fight became a blur of motion, riders charging down into the riverbed. Jack meeting them with steel and lead, the air thick with dust and gunpowder. He felt a bullet graze his ribs, hot pain flaring, but he kept moving, kept shooting. A man came at him with a hatchet, and Jack sidestepped, driving his shoulder into the man's chest and sending him sprawling into the bank. Then Caleb was there, dropping into the riverbed like a predator, a long knife in his hand. His eyes were cold, calculating, and there was no rush in his movements. He circled Jack slowly, the chaos of the fight fading into the background. "You've been a thorn in my family's side for too long," Caleb said, his voice low but carrying. "Time to pull you out." Jack didn't answer. Words wouldn't change what was about to happen. Caleb struck first, the knife flashing in the dusty light. Jack twisted, the blade grazing his sleeve, and countered with a hard right that caught Caleb on the jaw. Caleb staggered but didn't fall, coming back with a slash that opened a shallow line across Jack's forearm. Pain flared, but Jack ignored it, stepping in close for the knife to be fully effective. They grappled, boots slipping in the loose dirt, each man straining for advantage. Caleb was strong, but Jack fought with the desperation of a man who knew there was no second chance. He caught Caleb's wrist, twisted hard, and the knife clattered to the ground. Caleb lunged for it, but Jack drove his knee into the man's gut, then slammed him back against the bank for a heartbeat. They locked eyes, Caleb's filled with fury, Jack's with the cold certainty of what came next. The Colt barked once, the sound deafening in the narrow space. Caleb's body went slack, sliding down the bank to rest in the dust. The remaining riders saw their leader fall and broke, spurring their horses away in a cloud of dust. Jack stood there, chest heaving, the smell of gunpowder and blood thick in the air. He holstered his Colt slowly, the weight of the moment settling over him. The McGraw name was finished. He climbed out of the riverbed, the sun high and hot now, the land stretching endless and empty ahead. Each step felt heavier, but there was a strange lightness too, the kind that comes when a man knows he's finally closed a chapter that's been open too long. Jack didn't look back. He never did. The sun was already leaning west when Jack left the dry riverbed behind. The fight with Caleb had drained him, but the land didn't care. It stretched on, endless and indifferent, the heat shimmering above the dirt. He kept moving, one boot in front of the other, the weight of his Colt a familiar anchor at his side. For the first time in days, there were no hoofbeats behind him, no dust clouds on the horizon, but the quiet didn't feel like safety. It felt like the pause between lightning and thunder by late afternoon. He reached a cluster of low hills, their slopes dotted with scrub and rock. From the crest of the tallest, he could see for miles, the pale ribbon of the trail winding away, the distant glint of water where a creek cut through the plain, and far to the north, a faint smudge of movement. He narrowed his eyes. Riders, not many, maybe 5 or 6, but they were moving with purpose. Jack crouched low, watching them. They weren't McGraw men, at least, not the ones he recognized. Their gear was mismatched, their horses lean but fast. Drifters, maybe. Or worse, scavengers, the kind who followed bloodshed like vultures, picking over the remains. He stayed on the ridge until they passed out of sight, then dropped down the far side, keeping to the shadows. The land here was rougher, the trail broken by gullies and dry washes. It slowed him, but it also gave him cover. As the light began to fade, he found a narrow ravine and made camp. No fire, the glow would carry for miles, just a strip of jerky and a canteen of warm water. He sat with his back to the rock, listening to the wind whistle through the stones. Somewhere out there, coyotes called to each other, their voices thin and sharp in the dark. He was almost drifting into that half-sleep of the trail when he heard it, the faint clink of metal on stone. His eyes snapped open. The sound came again, closer this time. Someone was moving in the ravine. Jack slid silently to his feet, Colt in hand. The moonlight spilled just enough silver over the rocks to catch the shape of a man, creeping along the edge. Another shadow followed, then another. 3 of them. They moved like men who thought they were hunting. Jack waited until they were close enough to see the whites of their eyes, then stepped from the shadows. "You're a long way from anywhere worth being," he said, his voice low but carrying. The first man froze. The second went for his gun. Jack's shot cracked through the night, the muzzle flash lighting the ravine walls. The man dropped, his weapon clattering on the stone. The third bolted, scrambling up the slope, but Jack's second shot caught him in the leg, sending him tumbling back down. The first man raised his hands slowly, eyes darting between Jack and the bodies. "We weren't looking for trouble," he said. Jack's gaze was cold. "You found it anyway." He let the man live, but only because killing him would have been a waste of a bullet. "Tell whoever sent you," Jack said, "that I'm still walking." The man nodded quickly and vanished into the dark, limping after his wounded companion. Jack holstered his Colt and sat back against the rock, the night closing in around him again. He knew this wasn't over. Caleb's death had left a hole, and holes like that didn't stay empty for long. Someone would step in, someone meaner or smarter or both. And when they did, they'd come looking for the man who'd put the McGraws in the ground. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of rain from far off. Jack tilted his head back, staring at the stars. Out here, the sky was so wide it could make a man feel small enough to disappear. But Jack knew better. Men like him didn't disappear. They left trails, in the dust, in the blood, in the stories whispered in saloons. And somewhere out there, another trail was already leading toward him. The rain came in the small hours, a thin, cold drizzle that turned the dust to a slick paste under Jack's boots. He'd been walking since before dawn, keeping to the low ground, letting the hills shield him from whatever eyes might be searching. The land smelled different now, wet earth, sagebrush, and something else, faint but sharp, like wood smoke carried from far away. By midday, the clouds had thinned, leaving the sky a washed-out gray. Jack crested a ridge and stopped. Below, in a shallow basin, lay the remains of a camp. The fire was cold, the ashes scattered by the wind, but the ground was churned with hoofprints. Whoever had been here had left in a hurry, and not long ago. He crouched, running a hand over the tracks. At least 8 horses, maybe more. The prints were deep, the edges still sharp. They were headed southeast. He followed at a steady pace, the trail easy to read in the damp earth. Hours passed, the land flattening into open prairie. The wind picked up, carrying with it the distant rumble of thunder. Jack's eyes stayed on the horizon, scanning for movement. It was late afternoon when he saw them, a line of riders moving slow, almost casual, as if they had no reason to hurry. They were too far to make out faces, but their formation was tight, disciplined. Not drifters, not scavengers. This was a crew with purpose. Jack dropped to one knee, watching. They didn't look like McGraw men, but that didn't mean they weren't connected. Caleb's death had left a hole, and holes like that drew all kinds of predators. He shadowed them from a distance, keeping low, using the folds of the land for cover. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, the riders veered toward a cluster of cottonwoods by a narrow creek. Jack circled wide, coming in from the downwind side, from his vantage point in the trees. He could hear them now, low voices, the clink of gear, the creak of saddle leather. One voice carried above the rest, calm but commanding. Jack eased closer, careful not to snap a twig. "We move at first light," the voice was saying. "He's out here, and he's tired. We keep the pressure on, he'll make a mistake." Jack's jaw tightened. They were hunting him. He slipped back into the shadows, retreating the way he'd come. He needed distance, and he needed it before dawn. But as he reached the edge of the trees, a shape stepped into his path. A tall man, broad-shouldered, with a rifle leveled at Jack's chest. "Going somewhere?" the man asked. Jack's eyes flicked past him, 2 more shapes emerging from the dark, cutting off his retreat. His hand hovered near the Colt, but he didn't draw. "Not yet." The tall man smiled without warmth. "Boss wants a word." Jack said nothing. The rain had started again, soft and steady, pattering on the leaves. Somewhere behind him, the creek murmured over stones. He could feel the weight of the moment, the way the air seemed to hold its breath. 3 men. Close range. No cover. If he was going to get out of this, it would have to be fast. The tall man's rifle didn't waver, the black circle of its barrel fixed squarely on Jack's chest. The rain was steady now, dripping from the brim of Jack's hat, running cold down the back of his neck. The 2 others flanking him were younger, but their eyes had the same hard glint. Men who'd seen blood before and weren't afraid to spill more. Jack's fingers twitched near the Colt, but he kept them loose, his breathing slow. The tall man's stance told him everything. Weight slightly forward, left foot planted, right foot ready to pivot. He was a shooter, and a good one. The kind who didn't miss at this range. "Boss wants a word," the man repeated, his voice low and even. Jack tilted his head slightly, as if considering. "Funny thing," he said, "I'm not much for conversation." The man's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "You'll be." The younger one on Jack's left shifted his grip on the shotgun, just a fraction, but enough. Jack moved, his left hand shot up, grabbing the rifle barrel and shoving it skyward as his right hand drew the Colt. In one smooth motion, the rifle roared, the shot going harmlessly into the trees. Jack's Colt barked twice, the first round catching the shotgunner in the shoulder, spinning him away, the second slamming into the dirt at the feet of the man on the right. Forcing him back, the tall man recovered fast, wrenching the rifle free and swinging the stock toward Jack's head. Jack ducked, felt the rush of air as the wood passed inches from his skull, and drove his shoulder into the man's midsection. They hit the ground hard, rolling in the wet leaves. The rifle clattered away. Jack came up on top, his Colt pressed under the man's chin. The man froze, chest heaving, rain running down his face. "Who's your boss?" Jack asked, his voice flat. The man's jaw tightened. "You'll find out soon enough." Jack's eyes didn't blink. Wrong answer. He brought the Colt down hard across the man's temple. The body went limp. Jack was on his feet in an instant, scanning the trees. The wounded shotgunner was gone, dragging himself into the dark. The third man had vanished entirely. Jack didn't waste time. He grabbed the tall man's rifle, slung it over his shoulder, and melted into the shadows, moving fast and low. He knew the others would regroup, and when they did, they'd bring more men. The rain eased as he put distance between himself and the creek, the clouds breaking just enough to let a pale wash of moonlight spill over the land. He kept moving until the trees thinned and the ground began to rise. From the top of the next ridge, he could see the faint glow of a campfire far to the east. He crouched, watching. The fire was too big for a small crew. This was a gathering, maybe a dozen men or more. He could make out the shapes of horses tied in a loose line, the glint of metal where rifles leaned against saddles. And there, near the fire, a figure stood apart from the rest, tall, lean, wearing a long coat that moved with the wind. Even at this distance, Jack could feel the weight of the man's presence. This wasn't a scavenger crew. This was organized. Jack stayed until the fire burned lower, committing every detail to memory. The way the men moved, the layout of the camp, the position of the horses. Then he slipped back down the ridge, heading west. He needed space to think, to plan. By dawn, he'd found a narrow bluff overlooking a dry wash. From here, he could see for miles in 3 directions. He sat with his back to the rock, the tall man's rifle across his knees, and let the first light spill over the land. Somewhere out there, a new player had stepped into the game. Someone who had the men, the discipline, and the will to come after him. Caleb McGraw's death hadn't ended the fight. It had just cleared the board for someone else to take the lead. Jack knew one thing for certain. Whoever this was, they weren't going to stop, and neither was he. The tall man's limp body had barely hit the wet ground before Jack was moving again, slipping through the trees like a shadow. The rain had thinned to a mist, but the air was heavy, the kind that carried sound too far. He knew the two who'd escaped would be talking by now, and their boss would hear every detail before the night was over. That meant the clock was already ticking. He kept low, weaving between the trunks, until the forest began to thin. Beyond it, the land opened into rolling grassland, the moonlight washing the hills in silver. Jack paused at the edge, scanning the horizon. Far off, a faint orange glow pulsed against the clouds, too steady for lightning, too warm for dawn. A camp. He circled wide, keeping to the low ground, until he found a shallow gully that led toward the light. The closer he got, the more he could hear, the muted clink of metal, the low murmur of voices, the occasional snort of a horse. He eased up the side of the gully and peered over the rim. The camp was larger than he'd expected. At least 20 men, maybe more, their tents arranged in a loose semicircle around a central fire. Rifles leaned against saddles, and a pair of sentries paced the perimeter. But it was the man by the fire who held Jack's attention. Tall, lean, with a long coat that shifted in the wind. He stood apart from the others, speaking to a knot of men who listened without interrupting. Even from here, Jack could feel the authority radiating off him. The man turned slightly, and the firelight caught his face. Jack's stomach tightened. He knew that face. Years ago, in a mining town called Red Hollow, they'd crossed paths, not as enemies, not yet, but as two men circling the same prize. Back then, the man had gone by the name Silas Kane, a gambler, a gunman, and a strategist who could turn a losing hand into a killing blow. Jack had beaten him once, and Kane had smiled in that slow, dangerous way that promised the debt would be paid in full someday. It looked like someday had arrived. Jack slid back down into the gully, heart steady, but mind racing. Kane wasn't like the McGraws. He wouldn't come charging in with guns blazing. He'd tighten the noose, cut off every escape, and wait for Jack to make a mistake. And with this many men, he had the muscle to back it up. Jack moved west, putting distance between himself and the camp until he found a narrow ravine with high walls. It was a defensible spot, but it also meant being cornered if things went bad. He crouched in the shadows, thinking. He couldn't take Kane head-on, not with 20 men at his back. He'd have to break them apart, draw them out, make them bleed in small numbers until Kane had no choice but to face him alone. The rain stopped completely, leaving the night sharp and clear. Jack could hear the creek somewhere nearby, the water whispering over stone. He sat with his back to the rock, the tall man's rifle across his knees, and let the plan start to take shape. Kane would send scouts at first light. Jack would be ready for them. And when Kane finally came himself, Jack would make sure it was the last time they ever stood in the same stretch of dirt. The first light of dawn crept over the horizon, painting the land in pale gold and long shadows. Jack had been awake for hours, crouched in the narrow ravine, listening to the slow stirrings of the world around him. Somewhere to the east, a meadowlark called, its song sharp in the stillness. Somewhere to the south, the faint clink of metal told him Kane's men were already moving. He'd expected scouts, and he wasn't disappointed. 2 riders appeared on the ridge above, their silhouettes black against the morning sky. They moved with the easy confidence of men who thought they were alone out here. Jack stayed low, letting them pass, then slipped out of the ravine and began to shadow them from below. The ground was damp from the night's rain, muffling his steps. He kept to the folds of the land, closing the distance until he could hear their voices. They were talking about him, about how Kane wanted him alive if possible, but dead if necessary. Jack smiled grimly. Kane was hedging his bets when the riders reached a narrow choke point between 2 boulders. Jack made his move. He stepped out from behind a rock, Colt in hand, and called, "Morning, boys." The nearer rider froze, eyes wide. The second went for his rifle, but Jack's shot was faster, the bullet slamming into the dirt at his horse's hooves. The animal reared, throwing the man hard to the ground. Jack closed the distance in 3 strides, kicking the rifle away and leveling the Colt at the man's chest. "Tell Kane I'm not running," Jack said. "Tell him if he wants me, he can come himself." The man on the ground nodded quickly, scrambling to his feet. The other turned his horse and bolted, the sound of hooves fading into the distance. Jack watched them go, then melted back into the rocks. By midday, he'd moved west again, keeping the sun at his back. The land here was rougher, broken by gullies and low ridges, perfect for ambushes. He found a vantage point overlooking a shallow valley and settled in to watch. It wasn't long before he saw them, a group of 6 riders moving in a loose line, scanning the ground for tracks. Kane was tightening the net. Jack studied them carefully, noting their weapons, their spacing, the way they kept glancing toward the hills. They were expecting trouble, but not from above. He waited until they were directly below, then opened fire. The first shot dropped the lead rider, the second sent the rest scattering for cover. Jack shifted position, firing from a new angle, keeping them guessing. Dust and gunpowder filled the air, the shouts of men echoing off the rocks. When it was over, 2 lay dead, 1 was wounded, and the rest had fled. Jack didn't chase them. He wanted them to run. He wanted them to tell Kane exactly what had happened here. As the sun dipped low, Jack found a sheltered hollow and made camp. He sat with his back to the rock, the tall man's rifle across his knees, and watched the sky turn from gold to crimson to deep indigo. Somewhere out there, Kane would be hearing the news. And when he came, and Jack knew he would, it would be just the 2 of them, with no more men to hide behind. The day broke under a sky the color of tarnished steel, the wind carrying the smell of rain and dust. Jack had been waiting since before first light, crouched in the shallow hollow he'd chosen the night before. He'd picked this place for a reason, a narrow stretch of trail hemmed in by jagged rock on one side and a steep drop on the other. No room for flanking, no easy escape. If Kane wanted him, this was where it would happen. The land was silent except for the wind, until the faint rhythm of hoof beats began to pulse through the ground. Jack rose slowly, brushing the dust from his coat, and stepped into the open. They came into view one by one, Kane's men, fewer now than before, their faces drawn and wary. And at their head, Silas Kane himself, tall in the saddle, his long coat snapping in the wind. His eyes found Jack instantly, and a slow smile curved his mouth. "You've been busy," Kane said. Reining in a few yards away, thinning the herd, Jack replied. Kane swung down from his horse with the easy grace of a man who'd done it 1,000 times. He handed the reins to one of his men without looking away from Jack. "I told myself I'd take you alive," he said. "But I think we both know how this ends." Jack's hand hovered near the Colt at his hip. "We do." The air between them tightened. the world narrowing to two men and the space that separated them. Kane's men spread out, forming a loose half-circle, but none stepped forward. They knew this wasn't their fight. Kane moved first, not with a draw, but with a feint, stepping left, testing Jack's reaction. Jack didn't bite. His eyes stayed locked on Kane's hands, on the subtle shift of weight in his stance. Then it happened, a blur of motion, Kane's revolver clearing leather, the sun flashing off the barrel. Jack's Colt was already in his hand, the report of both guns shattering the stillness. Kane's shot tore past Jack's shoulder, close enough to feel the heat. Jack's bullet caught Kane high in the arm, spinning him sideways. Kane staggered but didn't fall, coming back with a second shot that grazed Jack's ribs. Pain flared hot, but Jack stepped in, closing the distance before Kane could fire again. They collided hard, the revolvers knocked aside, fists and elbows replacing bullets. Kane was strong, but Jack fought with the raw, unyielding force of a man who'd been hunted too long. A punch to the jaw sent Kane reeling. A knee to the gut doubled him over. Kane lashed out with a wild swing, but Jack caught his wrist, twisted, and drove him back against the rock wall. For a moment, they were locked there, breath ragged, eyes locked. Kane's defiance burned bright, but there was something else now, the flicker of realization. Jack stepped back just enough to draw the Colt again. "This is where it ends," he said, voice low. Kane's mouth opened, maybe to curse, maybe to bargain. But the shot cut him off. The sound rolled through the rocks, echoing into the distance. Kane slid down the wall, his coat pooling around him, the life gone from his eyes. The half-circle of men didn't move. One by one, they backed away, mounting their horses without a word. By the time Jack holstered his Colt, the trail was empty except for him and the body at his feet. The wind shifted, carrying the first drops of rain. Jack turned his face to it, letting the cool water wash the dust and sweat from his skin. The McGraws were gone. Kane was gone. The long hunt was over. He walked to his horse, swung into the saddle, and looked once more at the narrow trail behind him. Then he turned west, toward the open land and the endless horizon, the rain falling steady now, erasing his tracks almost as soon as they were made. Jack didn't look back. He never did.